Hello and welcome to the Last Word on Spurs. We do hope you're keeping very, very safe and well. Thank you so much for joining us as the transfer window edges ever closer to the finishing line, and us Spurs fans continue to panic, worry about what Spurs need to do in these remaining 9, 10 days, 8 days for those that are listening back on the morning commute. If you're listening to the show for the first time, where have you been? We're on iTunes, we're on Spotify, we're across all major audio platforms. We're, of course, on Twitter at Last Word On Spurs. We're on Facebook and Instagram too. And before we introduce the main man we've got back on our show tonight, joining me is another main man back on our screens. Internet fine, dog away from the router. We've got the wonderful Matty Hayes back on the show. Matt, how are you, my friend? You well?
I'm never going to live that one down, am I? The one time the dogs misbehave, and that's just now that's the brand that I have on here. But look, always a pleasure being on here, and I'm really excited to hear what Ben has to say tonight. It's always a fantastic show. So I'm looking forward to a great chat.
Absolutely. Now, Matt gave away the half part there. We have got a Ben, but the man we have got is the wonderful Ben Jacobs, sports broadcaster, journalist. Ben, lovely to have you back on Last Word on Spurs. You're looking fresh, considering we're only 8-9 days to go to the window. How do you do it? How are you doing this, Ben?
I don't think I'm looking fresh. I think I age about 15 years during a transfer window. And to explain the slightly dodgy background, I've just got off a flight on the way back from Saudi Arabia. So I'm in a hotel in the confines of a Holiday Inn, which is why, unfortunately, I'm not as fresh as I would like to be. But only a few days left of the window. And I think that Spurs are going to be very busy. So it's great to be back on the show.
Likewise, Ben. Pleasure is always ours. Pleasure is always ours. Now, just a bit of housekeeping on Last Word on Spurs. And if you hadn't known already, before we get into all the great stuff we've got to come, that Last Word on Spurs, I'm delighted to say, is in the process of being nominated for the FCA Awards for the best podcast. You can help us get there. Yes, you can help us get there. You can help us secure a trophy for Last Word on Spurs. And fair to say, we've been starved of success as Tottenham. So help us get over the line. You can nominate us by tweeting, I am voting in the FCAs for Last Word on Spurs in best podcast in the Premier League. Or alternatively, you can visit footballcontentawards.com/voting/ or listen, we're very modern on this show. You've even got a QR code down there that will take you straight to the website. We try our best. So again, if you love what we do, and again, appreciate you guys and what you bring to the show, and again, we massively appreciate that. Give us a vote, and we massively, massively appreciate it. Right, we're going to get into the main stuff now. What we know is 8-9 days to go of what we expect to be a frantic finish of this transfer window. But before I do that, it would be wrong of me, Ben, not to ask you about Spurs' head coach, Ange Postecoglou. We had you on early in the summer, and I think it's fair to say at the time, I believe you were, again, reasonably excited with what was to come from this man. Mm-hmm. And when you consider the fact Spurs have started 4 points from a possible 6, the man's name has been sung around the ground if he's been here for years. I've got to ask you, Ben, what have you made so far of what's been referenced in terms Ange Ball and the fact Spurs fans are falling in love with this man ever so quickly?
Well, I think he's a bit of a cult figure, and ultimately what he represents is what Spurs fans want, which is why the fan base have taken to him so quickly. And you couldn't get a bigger extreme from Conte Ball to Ange Ball via 2 interims. And it isn't just about changing from a back 3. It's a completely new philosophy. It's far more gung-ho. It's front foot. There's no inferiority complex. And all of this adds up to a fan base that feel like Spurs are essentially going to have a go. And it's funny, isn't it, in football? We can talk about tactical changes. We can talk about transfers. We can talk about all the finesse of game management, data, science. But at the end of the day, you want to see your 11 starters and substitutes have a go and feel like they can win. And when you're Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, whether you're playing a bottom half team or one of the other so-called big 6, you have to feel like you're going to control the game, especially at home. And this is what we've seen. Even though the opening game of the season was only a draw, there were lots of encouraging signs, including 2 assists from James Maddison. And against Manchester United, to get the victory and in that manner shows you again that Postecoglou is not coming in scared of any teams, and he's not coming in scared of the fact that it's a step up for him as well. So we're going to see a progressive Spurs team with ball-playing defenders, with midfielders that are incisive in their passing. And it's great, by the way, to see Bissouma in the starting lineup and doing well, because he could still end up being an inspired signing, even though he dates Postecoglou's arrival. And then, of course, up top, if Tottenham can find a way of getting these goal contributions without Harry Kane, they'll do well. Because in essence, if Tottenham give it a go and let in a few less goals than last season, they won't be too far off Champions League football. And it's funny to me because so much has been made of Harry Kane and the departure. And obviously that is gutting from a Tottenham point of view. But it's the defence that needed fixing last season. So yes, you're pulling 30 Premier League goals from the side, but you can't just remove those 30 and say they won't be replaced because someone's going to step up and score. So to see Tottenham be defensively disciplined against Manchester United and Vicario makes some outstanding saves adds up to a lot of promise. And I think that when the Tottenham fan base see a manager that wears his heart on his sleeve and is honest and is quite humble and is firm but fair, and they realize that the brand of football, win, lose or draw, is going to be exciting to watch, then that creates a buzz around the football club. And I don't think that Postecoglou could have asked for a better start.
I think you've perfectly summed up there, Ben, the fantastic work that's going on the pitch and building towards the Tottenham that we all want to see. But before we do go into that in a bit more detail, I want to ask you a few bits about off the pitch. And there were reports last week that Tottenham were considering bringing in Barcelona's Mateu Alemany as a new director of football when he's available in September. And I'm sure all the viewers and listeners will remember the debacle with Aston Villa in May when he was expected to go there and ended up staying at Barcelona. But we expect there to be movement soon. Have you heard anything specific about a potential interest from Spurs in Mateu Alemany? And just following on from that, I want to ask as well if you know if there's any start date yet for Scott Munn, who we've been waiting to hear about.
Yeah, as you say, the start date for Scott Munn has been delayed. And what we have to understand here is that when Paratici was at the football club, he effectively had two roles, a general manager and a director of football type position. And now there's two people, of which Munn is the more senior. So any new director of football reports up to Munn. And Munn has not officially started, even though he was spotted during pre-season. So there'll be a delay on the appointment of the sporting director for two reasons. One, that Munn has to input and can do so from afar, but the exit terms from Manchester City are more complicated than perhaps Tottenham first expected when they were hoping to get him in the early part of the window. And then the second thing is just any candidate that Spurs go for, should they be incumbent, may have a restriction in when they can start. So with Alemany, it's a little bit easier because he is outgoing, and that will allow Tottenham an opportunity, if they move in that direction, to certainly have him in time for January. And I understand that he is on the list, but there's other names as well. Thiago Pinto has been considered, and historically anyway, Brentford's Lee Dykes had impressed, although I'm not aware of any active or new talks with Dykes at this point. But some of these names are incumbent and will have a form of gardening leave, potentially preventing them from even impacting the January window. So I think Tottenham's strategy was originally to have obviously Antonio Conte, who they were not expecting originally earlier as far as last season was concerned, staying until the end of the season. And then when the Paratici ban came in, they did want to move first and foremost to get in a sporting director. But now things have pivoted and almost happened backwards in terms of the original Spurs plan. So it became Postecoglou first and Munn coming in but not starting, and the sporting director is last. But what that does is it gives Postecoglou a little bit more say. So if you look, for example, at Aston Villa, Emery came in first, and then it's clear that when Monchi arrived, it was partially because Emery and Monchi have worked and like each other, and there's a relationship there. So I think that Postecoglou will have more say than necessarily people think about the appointment of a sporting director. So Alemany is certainly on the list, but again, I'm told that there's still 3 or 4 candidates that are under active consideration. And with Munn, I think Tottenham is still quite optimistic that he will be able to come in relatively soon after this window shuts, and certainly in time to prepare as far as both recruitment of a sporting director and the January window is concerned.
Ben, thanks so much for that update. Really appreciate it. If we have a look at obviously what Spurs have done so far during this window, which of course you've been a part of and you've been on here and told us a lot in terms of what Spurs were looking to do. Spurs recently completed deals, of course, over the last couple of weeks for Mickey van der Ven and, of course, Argentina forward Alejo Veliz. They joined the likes, of course, as we know, of James Maddison. We saw, of course, Ashley Phillips, Guillermo Vicario and Israeli winger Mana Solomon through the door so far. just intrigued now before we get to discuss names, obviously specific names, what have you made overall of the incomings during this summer transfer window for Tottenham? Are they what you expected? Would you expect them to be more ambitious? What do you think for you?
Well, I think time will tell on the ambition, but clearly, if you look back to last summer, there was a lot of ambition and spending, but not necessarily that many starters in hindsight, people that were brought in that were dropped into the starting 11 and had an impact. So it ended up being depth. And I've said many times in the build up to this window that what Tottenham need from some of their new signings are names that almost near indisputably can be dropped into the starting 11. And with Vicario, that's quite clearly the case. And I think it's the same with James Maddison. And at the moment, anyway, with Mickey van de Ven too. So you've got three there that all could form a spine. And then if Song gets going and Basuma becomes standout in midfield, you start to think, particularly in central areas and versatile forward-thinking areas, there's real strength and consistency in selection. So you can certainly understand what Postecoglou, who's had a big say in this window, is trying to do. And usually, of course, when we talk about a window, we'd be saying Daniel Levy, we'd be saying Paratici, but I do think it's fair to say Postecoglou in this window simply because he's had a lot of say. And Conte had quite a bit of say last summer as well. But due to the fact that everything's been so transitional at Tottenham, I think Postecoglou has been able to really be a very prominent voice when he speaks to Daniel Levy and final decisions are made. So my feeling is that Tottenham have had a very solid window with Vicario. He's the type of goalkeeper that Postecoglou is looking for. And he showed what he was capable of with an outstanding save against Manchester United from Casemiro. I think from memory, he made another good one from Rashford as well. So 2 or 3 saves in that game in a Tottenham win. And that will help him get the confidence to feel that he can immediately hit the ground running. So there's other positions that come into the Premier League and those type of players need time, but you can't have that as a starting Spurs goalkeeper. You've got to hit the ground running. And I think he's done that at the moment. Now, there might be some Spurs fans in the chat. I'll be intrigued to read some of your comments that feel like Raya would have been more solid, more reliable, one of the top 4 goalkeepers in the Premier League last season. But ultimately, it was a different stage of the window. And it is a little bit odd in hindsight because I can understand why a Spurs fan would say Arsenal have ended up getting a total package via a loan for 30 odd million and Tottenham were quibbling over a fee that was higher than 30 million, but not 40 million. And they couldn't agree anything. And this is unfortunately just the movement of the market and how things change. And Brentford ultimately in the end had an urgency to sell David Raya. So the price dropped. But I think from Raya's point of view, he either must have been given some guarantees at Arsenal that he is going to supplant Aaron Ramsdale, or why not push for the Spurs move where you would have been a starting goalkeeper? This is a keeper that I think played every game in the Premier League for Brentford last season. If he's on the bench at Arsenal, he could have been starting every week for Spurs. So there might still be a Vicario Raya type debate amongst the fan base. But my sense with Vicario is he's a bit of a gem, a decent shot stopper, more than in fact a decent shot stopper, and has the right attitude and mentality. He's quite vocal from the back. He's very athletic and instinctive. He's not afraid to come off his line and he moves the ball out quickly when he has the opportunity, which means that he can start a counter-attack from the back. And this is what Postecoglou wants from his goalkeepers. If you go back, for example, to Celtic, one of the issues when Joe Hart was there was he was the wrong kind of goalkeeper. But generally, Postecoglou wants somebody that can almost operate as that third centre-back. And Vicario falls into that category. With Van de Ven, I think he is aggressive. He is intelligent, but he's not rash. Very rarely will you see him lunge or commit into a tackle. So he's got that right level of controlled aggression and patience and intelligence. And the most underrated quality from what I've seen is just the way that he subtly will delay an attack. So sometimes when we judge a defender, we're looking at aerial duels, we're looking at whether they're composed on the ball, and we're working out how they operate in a back 4 in terms of movement and awareness, especially when a defender is on their shoulder. But keep an eye on what he does that goes unsung to just stifle rhythm. And it might be that the ball is in another place, but he moves into a position. He stays on the shoulder of a defender on-goal side, or he does something physically or mentally just to get in the head of the attacking phase of play and slow it down. And it might only be by a fraction, but that kind of marginal gain might be the difference to keep that back line in shape. So that's definitely one of his best qualities. And then with Maddison, I just think he's an outstanding signing. And I think when I first came on Last Word on Spurs, I'd said that it was Tottenham who were interested, and there wasn't really much about the link at that point. And that tells you that this is a long-standing target. And then when Postecoglou came in, my understanding is that he really put his foot down and said, you were thinking of him, but I want him. We will get him. And for Maddison, London was important. Settling his future quite early was important because he's just had two beautiful new twins, Dier and Rome. So Newcastle were there for a little bit, but the decision of the player was very quickly Tottenham. And that's ultimately why it was quite a smooth negotiation with Leicester. And with Maddison, if he recaptures the form of the first half of last season before he got injured prior to the World Cup, then Spurs have got one of the best players in that position in all of the Premier League. So those three, I think, are really the core and most exciting for me anyway. Ashley Phillips has come in. Manor Solomon is just a great signing if you're judging him on value, and in the back end of last season was in red hot form. So I think that Tottenham have done well to cover certain positions, bring in quality, excite the fan base. And now we wait and see if there's room for two more. And if there is, it could be some form of, in inverted commas, Kane replacement. And in addition, they might still move for a centre-back as well.
I have to say, I feel like I should be taking notes listening to you speak about this stuff, Ben. And we appreciate that answer. And I do want to expand on one point you made there about how Postecoglou seems to be really in control of a lot of stuff that's going on in this window. And for the benefit of anyone who might not have had the Sky Sports interview after the game on Saturday, the host asked him if he was given the chance to assess the squad and decide who needs to be moved on. And he kind of looked at the presenter and laughed a little bit and said, I wouldn't let anyone else do that for me. So I think even he is willing to make that point, that he is in charge of this. And another point he did make is that despite the signings of Mickey van de Ven and Ashley Phillips, that he is keen on bringing in another centre-back, we assume dependent on who can be shipped out between now and the deadline on the 1st of September. And in terms of names that we've been linked with there, Edmund Tapsoba of Bayer Leverkusen is a name that hasn't gone away yet in this window. And more recently, Tosin Adarabioyo from Fulham and Torino's Per Shores, with Clement Longley, always just an undertone of Clement Longley as an option as we approach that deadline as well. Do you have any knowledge, Ben, on as to what centre-backs Tottenham might make a move for?
Yeah, I think the names that you've mentioned have all been considered at different points of the window. Tapsoba can't be ruled out, that's for sure. Leverkusen have not been easy negotiators on that one, which is partially why Tottenham turned their attention to Van de Ven first and was successful. But it was clear when they were negotiating for Van de Ven that the door was still open for another centre-back. So Tapsoba could be one to watch between now and the end of the window. With Tosin, my understanding was always that he preferred to sign for Monaco, but from Fulham's point of view, they were perhaps interested in some kind of deal that might involve Eric Dier going the other way. So we wait and see whether the player changes his mind. But from Monaco's perspective, they're still tracking Tosin at the moment. Shores, I think, is still being discussed internally and could be a player at a little bit more value than some of the other names being discussed. And Longley is the sort of safe pair of hands. And then we have to understand whether or not Postecoglou feels that he's the right kind of fit. I think he did well at Tottenham last season. Barcelona's perspective is that they want a fee, and from Tottenham's position, they believe that should be quite a low number, perhaps even under £5 million. And this is the sort of balance with everything. It was almost easier to do Longley when it was a loan, because it was clear from Barcelona's perspective at that point that they needed him off the wage bill. And now Barca are being a little bit more aggressive towards the back end of the window. So it wouldn't surprise me if Tottenham balance a few other options. And if they don't succeed in a centre-back, come back for Longley in the final few days of the window. And that's the unpredictable nature at this time. You're spinning lots of plates. So people need to understand that the way this stage of the window works is you're waiting for movement in the market. Some targets won't be available because the club that will sell are waiting for a replacement. some of it's gamesmanship to take it down to the final few days of the window to see who's bluffing over their position and their fee. So you're going to hear a lot of walking away, a lot of not interested anymore, but is it actually the reality? And I think West Ham have been the arch negotiators of saying that all window. They're going to walk away from James Ward-Prowse. They signed James Ward-Prowse. They might walk away from Mohamed Kudus. They're very close to a deal now for Mohamed Kudus. So don't be surprised if you get a bit of smoke and mirrors, but I still think that Tottenham will bring in a centre-back between now and the close of the window. And I don't think it has to be left-sided or right-sided specifically, because Postecoglou is one of those managers, much like Mauricio Pochettino, that believes he can play 2 right-sided centre-backs or 2 left-sided centre-backs in a back 4. It doesn't make a great deal of difference as long as he finds the right kind of player. And then to throw in a more distant name, a surprise name, I don't think anything's advanced at this point because Leicester's position is clear that they don't want to sell, but just keep a small eye on Wout Faes, who obviously went down with Leicester and was the Wesley Fofana replacement from last summer who went to Chelsea. And there's a few clubs looking, and I'm told that Tottenham are one of them, that have at least discussed the possibility internally. It doesn't feel like a deal at this stage that's going to progress because of Leicester's position. It would be a big surprise. But again, it's evidence that Tottenham have got probably in excess of 6 centre-back names that they're prepared to move for, which is why I'm quite confident that by the time the window closes, they will have one more through the door.
Ben, just on that point, in terms of the additional defender, I think what many are inquiring or wondering, again, be interested to get your thoughts on it, because of the fact they have spent quite heavily on Van de Ven, and obviously you've got Romero there, do you think Spurs would logically go for yet another big senior centre-back? I mean, I would want them to, because I'm concerned that if you do lose a Romero or Van de Ven, you are then down, in the most polite way I say this, to, again, Dier or Sanchez, that have shown themselves really to, in the most polite way over the course of many years, to not be adequate enough to be able to feature, in my opinion, in the first team. So do you think the money is substantially there for a Tapsoba still, despite the fact they're moving for a Mickey Van de Ven and the price they've paid?
Well, the money's there. I don't buy into this. Tottenham spent the Kane fee before they got the Kane fee. I think the reality of the situation is just they needed a revamp in certain areas. And as a consequence, Daniel Levy decided to spend. Therefore, with the Kane fee, and we'll come on to Kane, I know, in a bit, the money won't necessarily be an issue. And by the way, my understanding is that even though people are reporting the Kane deal as at or around 100 million, with all of the different add-ons included, I'm actually told it's a little bit higher than that. So it's a fantastic bit of business if you're only looking at that deal financially from Tottenham's point of view. And I do think that another centre-back and a senior one is what Postecoglou is looking for. Obviously, switching to a back 4 means that he doesn't have to find that third centre-back to be a starter, because as I said prior to the last question, when we were talking about Vicario, there is a feeling that the goalkeeper under Ange Ball can sort of play sweeper keeper and when necessary drop into that third centre-back position when he has to come off his line and mop up or somebody else is out of position. But the reason I think that they need someone with a little bit of experience is because Christian Romero is a little bit of a wild card. So on the one hand, at his best and under Postecoglou, you say there is a stalwart partnership for the season and anybody else coming in is just part of the depth. But on the other hand, he had a little bit of a mixed season, in my opinion, last campaign. Very confident on the ball, but also nonchalant at times and relatively inconsistent. So I don't think at this stage we can say he's fixed or that he's improved his level of consistency only 2 games in, to the point where Postecoglou can say 100% that he is the other starting centre-back. I think what you say is if Romero is at his best under Postecoglou, it's incredibly exciting. And anyone else will struggle to displace that partnership. But what if Romero ends up dropping back to last season's form where he was a little bit indifferent? Then you suddenly start saying, is there anybody else at the football club that can challenge him, that can compete with him? And that's why I think the centre-back depth is going to be important. And then if everything goes according to plan, you want to get ahead of yourself. So Tottenham are obviously under the presumption, come what may, that they're going to be getting into some form of European football next season, and that means more games. So if you can find the right profile now, then why not try and move? So then when you get to next summer, you're not scrambling around because the centre-back situation has already been dealt with. And then I think the other thing with Tottenham that put them on the back foot a little bit with the centre-back is just all of this change and upheaval, because you plan windows ahead. And under Paratici, it was one style. And at the beginning of the season, looking at a year ahead to this summer, it was obviously all based upon Conte ball. It was defensive minded. It was back three. And some of the names that they were looking at, they weren't able to attain. Barella's one example, Skriniar's another example. And then suddenly you get this state of flux. And what do? Because you're without Scott Munn, you're without a sporting director, they were without a manager. Very difficult to convince players in the build-up to the summer that they should join when they don't know the style, they don't know the manager, they don't know the sporting director. And at that point, when you were talking to them in the build-up to the window, they also didn't know whether Tottenham would have any European football, because it was very tight at that stage and it could have gone either way. So it was quite a difficult state for Spurs to be in. And I think that, for example, put off a player like Evan Ndicka, who ended up joining Roma, and he would have been a good signing because he was a budget signing with a high ceiling and potential on a free transfer. Tottenham didn't move in the end, but that sort of profile was also discussed under Paratici, and nothing really ever came of it. The last name, by the way, that I would mention on the centre-back, even though I think it's more potentially Liverpool and still very possibly West Ham, is Hincapié as well, who's a left-sided centre-back with a very high potential, good experience, and Tottenham have certainly run the numbers and the data on him. I don't think at this stage they've added him to the shortlist, but he might be a name to watch as far as moving to the Premier League over the course of the coming weeks. I don't think that it's accurate at this stage to say that Spurs are in the race or considering him, but keep an eye on that point that I said before about what if you miss out on one target, who do you pivot to or scramble to in the last hours of the window? And that's where you might get some surprises. But I'm told if it is to be a Premier League club at the moment, the player would love Liverpool, but Liverpool are not necessarily sold. And West Ham, who have missed out on Harry Maguire, are still another club to watch.
Ben, from a financial standpoint, I just want to ask, do you know if Spurs are almost being hurt in their centre-back pursuit because of how much people know we need a centre-back? You know, you look at the back three that we played last year, Romero, Dier and Longley. It's no secret that Dier isn't in the plans for this season, and Longley is, of course, gone. Do you think clubs might be inflating those prices knowing how kind of desperate we are to get some bodies in?
I think it's just a crazy window, and covering it for all clubs, that's been apparent. It's not a Spurs tax per se. Every fan base probably feels like a tax is being added, but guess what? That's just what a seller does. It's probably fair to say that Daniel Levy added a Harry Kane tax to Bayern Munich. That's their perspective as well, but it won't get spoken about because Tottenham fans just see Kane as someone that was indispensable to the football club. So if you get that 100 or 100 plus million, fantastic bit of business. But if you ask a Bayern fan, it's a tax because Bayern had the urgency, the player wanted the move, and in the end, they kind of got cornered by Daniel Levy. They showed their hand. Thomas Tuchel was obsessed with Kane. So what can you do if you're invested in that transfer other than eventually pay the asking price, which is exactly what Chelsea did with Moises Caicedo and to a lesser extent Romeo Lavia. So I think every club's fan base tells the same story. Why is the selling club being so difficult? Why is the selling club adding money? Why is the selling club not just giving us the player at the price we want? And that is just business. But in this window, there's a sort of new yardstick. And that's partially because of the big spending from Saudi Arabia that's setting different valuations. That's partly because of Chelsea since January in particular. And I think it's just a byproduct of the fact that so far since the Premier League started, every window's gone up and up and up, and only stringent changes to financial fair play and the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules are really going to alter that, because we're constantly just seeing a bog standard Premier League player. And I don't mean this disrespectfully, because obviously a bog standard Premier League player is still exceptional. They're still world class at their trade. So bog standard is not meant in a derogatory way, but if they're middle of the pack statistically in the Premier League, then 4 or 5 seasons ago, you'd be saying it could be an inspired signing, maybe for 10 to 15 million. And that kind of player has become 30, 35 million. And a young player who's unproven in the Premier League, but with a higher ceiling, is suddenly 50 to 60 million, as we've seen with Romeo Lavia, and a real star for the future that's in demand, like Enzo Fernandez or Moises Caicedo, is over 100 million. So it's crazy, because I remember 4 or 5 seasons ago, people would always ask me, what would Spurs spend during the window? And I'd say if they are really ambitious and they want to bring in 3 or 4, maybe they'll spend 150 million quid. And if they get anywhere near 200 million, it will be exceptional. Now, if I give you 200 million, how many players can you get? It might only be 3. And that, unfortunately, is the modern market, which is why I think the same clubs that are spending so big are trying to sell so big.
Ben, it's fascinating. Honestly, it's fascinating. There is so much love pouring through the comments here for you. I have to say there really, really is. What we are going to do, we are going to go for our first break of the show for our listeners on audio. And obviously, when we come back for our listeners on audio, we'll be trying to move further up the pitch, but we'll be going back to one position that's still, quite unbelievably, we can't believe this man is still here. I want to say a massive, massive thank you. We're joined by the wonderful Matty Hayes on this Last Word On Spurs, back with us here. And we're joined by the superb, the brilliant broadcaster, sports journalist, the wonderful Ben Jacobs joins us here. And again, I've got to speak up on this, Ben. I don't know if you know Ali Gold personally. Obviously, Ali, big friend of Last Word On Spurs. Love, obviously, Ali, what he does over at Football London. Obviously, many will pick up on the fact that Ali does shoot on a blue background. I think we can just confirm, as Ben said at the very, very start of the show, Ben is currently not in Ali Gold's house.
I don't know. That's not being confirmed. That's not being confirmed. What's actually happening in all of this is that behind my camera, there's an auto cue, and Alistair Gold is there with a cup of tea, typing the answers in, because he's the true Spurs expert, one of the best in the business. So he's prompting me with all of the answers on a little auto cue whilst passing me a cup of tea, and maybe, just maybe, I'm in his basement.
Honestly, fantastic. Can I just say again, massive thank you for joining us. Over 1,000+ of you watching us live right now. Just a very brief reminder, if you don't mind, here, a bit of housekeeping. That Last Word On Spurs are delighted to be in the nominations for the Football Content Awards for 2023. You can nominate us via Twitter by voting. I'm voting in the FCAs for Last Word On Spurs in Best Podcast in Premier League, or go to footballcontentawards.com/voting. After this show, you'll have the description as well in our YouTube and audio feed for you to check it out. Right. Let's discuss, if we can, Ben, Hugo Lloris. I think he's, well, quite frankly, I think we're all honestly stunned that he's still here. Obviously, he made his, I'd say, case very, very clear. Well, during the end of the summer, or say during the end of the season, where he said he wants a new challenge. From what we understood, Lazio have been interested in him. There has been some interest from foreign clubs, but as of yet, nothing really in terms of a cast-iron guarantee of first-team football. Are you surprised, Ben, that he hasn't moved on? And do you have a hunch of where he may end up?
Well, I'm not surprised in the sense the feeling is Lloris still wants to be a starting goalkeeper, and that's part of the issue as far as the Lazio move is concerned. And if you start with the premise that he's not going to be a starting goalkeeper, then why not stay at Spurs if he's happy and comfortable and his family are prepared to do so? So Tottenham's position at the beginning of the window was a near certainty that Lloris would go, and now they're running out of time. The Lazio deal was a 2-year contract with the option of a 1-year extension, but has now been turned down. And part of that, as I say, is because the number one role is still quite important as far as Lloris is concerned. It doesn't have to be done before the European window shuts. There is some interest, I'm told, this week from Saudi Arabia. But actually, if you look at the top clubs in Saudi Arabia, many of them have got established goalkeepers. I'm told to keep an eye on Al-Shabaab. So if Lloris is still there in the first week in September, then let's see whether Saudi make a move, because their top flight window is open until September the 7th. Now, at Al-Shabaab, interestingly, is Kim Song-gyu, who's been at that club since 2013 and is their starting goalkeeper. And I think he even is a couple of years younger than Hugo Lloris. So if he comes in, there might be competition there, or potentially Kim would have to go. And then there's been some talk internally that Steven Gerrard might be interested at Al-Ittifaq as well, but they've got Paulo Victor in their goal too. So some of these bigger Saudi clubs have actually got a goalkeeper that they're happy and confident with. We know, for example, as well, that Edouard Mendy moved over to Saudi Arabia too. So there's not that many goalkeeper positions available in Saudi Arabia. And then I'm told that Lloris would love a return back to Nice, and that could be one to watch. But first it would require Kasper Schmeichel to leave. So remember before when we were talking about movement and one goalkeeper going and suddenly opening up an unexpected door, this one could be one to watch, because even though Lloris hasn't been able to engage yet with Nice about any kind of deal, there is a real feeling that Kasper Schmeichel could leave. The links with Chelsea as a number 2 didn't have anything to them. Nottingham Forest are the latest side to be linked with Schmeichel. But regardless of the clubs interested in Schmeichel, from Nice's point of view, I'm told that they've not been particularly happy with the last year as far as Kasper Schmeichel is concerned. So they're open to another goalkeeper, and who knows, that might give Lloris an unexpected opportunity in the final few days of the window. But the first thing that would have to happen there is Schmeichel would need to leave Nice, because again, Hugo Lloris is not going to return to that club and just sit on the bench. So we have to say at this point that there is suddenly a chance, a much, much bigger chance than a month or two ago, that the window could shut and Lloris could still be at Spurs.
Moving further up the pitch, Ben, to the defence, and Luton Town and Everton are reportedly interested in taking Japhet Tanganga on loan from Spurs this season, with Inter Milan's long-standing interest still there for the defender. Since making his debut in 2018, he's made 50 appearances for Spurs, but has never really been able to cement his place in that starting 11. And I think for the last couple of years, we've kind of been expecting a move away from the club. Are you expecting that to happen in the last 10 days of this window?
I think so, but let's see what Spurs' position is, because when there was more time in the window all the way up to last week, the Tottenham position was clear. They wanted to sell the player, permanent deal or nothing. And a lot of the clubs that you've mentioned, particularly Luton Town, were more looking at a loan deal and not necessarily with any kind of obligation to buy. And I think the reticence of Premier League clubs in particular is down to the fact that, as you said in the question, he made his debut in 2018. There's 50 odd appearances, but has failed to cement his place in the first team. So now we need to understand whether Spurs are prepared to bend on structure, because loan was definitely the Luton preference. I can tell you as well that Sevilla were interested in the player, but again, they wanted a loan and they were turned away. And that was about 4 weeks ago now. They haven't returned to my knowledge, but this is what some clubs do. They leave a lull and then they come back on the final few days of the window to try and put pressure on the club selling or loaning to do it their way. And Inter, as you say, may be keen on the player, but they're not in a strong financial position. And with Inter, the number one priority is still to bring in a striker. And even though they got that fee for Andre Onana to Manchester United, they're going to have to put the vast majority of that fee towards some form of striker, which means that anybody else coming in is unlikely to be affordable unless they get some kind of loan with option or obligation in order to delay the payment. So it's not a given, therefore, from the perspective of Tanganga, that he's going to get the club he wants or that Tottenham are going to get the structure that they want. But I think that in window terms, this might sound odd to say because everyone knows we're getting towards the end of the month, but in window terms, there's loads of time left to still play some games. You can place an offer today, tomorrow, the next day. You can let it sit. If you're the club considering selling, you can delay responding or have face-to-face talks. There's loads of time left in the window. But I think once we get to the beginning of next week and time is really ticking down, that's when we'll find out whether Tottenham are prepared to bend, because I'm not aware of a club at this point. It may change, but I'm not aware of a club at this point that's made Tottenham a permanent offer for Tanganga. Everyone inquiring prefers the loan, and Tottenham still prefer the permanent sale. So this is why we need to understand in the dynamic of negotiation whether it's Tottenham that are going to bend because it's their only solution, or whether someone will finally stump up the cash that Tottenham are looking for. And one of the reasons why Tottenham want to sell is not just because of the money, it's because of squad size as well, that you need to consider when you make as many signings as Spurs have made last summer, this summer, it all starts to add up. And much like Pochettino's saying at Chelsea, Postecoglou wants a manageable squad size. And in a non-European season, from Tottenham's perspective, you would be looking ideally at 25 or under. And I think if you add up everyone, you guys will know better than I do, but if you add up everyone in the Spurs squad, you must be above 35. You might even be a little bit closer to 40. So there's several outgoings in an ideal world, and permanent outgoings that Postecoglou, if it was only up to him, would want done sooner rather than later.
I think that is a concern, Ben, like you said there. I think from my understanding, it's around the 37, 38, 39 mark of such a bloated squad. I know there's people out there that are so frustrated that Spurs have become a club where, quite frankly, it's been so hard to move on some of the, if I most politely put this, the fringe players. They found it so hard as a football club. And there was a time where Spurs were really renowned for doing really well with their transfers. You could argue they've done well with Harry Winks, for example. They've got a decent fee for Harry Winks. I'm sure, Ben, you're going to enjoy watching him at Leicester. I think, again, he's a player that was just unfortunately really low on confidence at Tottenham. Needed a club that would settle him down, take him as one of their own. I'm sure Leicester will do that with Winksy, and no doubt you and obviously them will be back in the Premier League very soon. And I just think with Tottenham in general, it's definitely a problem over the last 4 or 5 years that they've really struggled to move players out. And again, that's why we're here 8-9 days after the window. And there's as much concern about bringing players in as there is about bringing or taking players out. Another player that came with such promise, we use that word potential. And again, there was a real excitement around the Spurs fan base when we got him, considering there was interest from other clubs at the time. And that was Jed Spence. It was a fee of around the 15 million mark. We're now hearing reports, Ben, from different sources that essentially his attitude hasn't been really up to the level that Postecoglou would maybe have liked. And therefore, he's now free to leave the club, which is a real shame, given the fact that he arrived with such potential. We, of course, had Antonio Conte's famous words telling us he was a club signing, which immediately casted doubt over the player as to whether he'd get the minutes. And let's be honest about it, he barely made any real substantial appearances for Tottenham last season. What does the future hold for him, Ben? Do you expect him to leave the club permanently, potentially between now and the end of this window?
I think that Tottenham's perspective would be exactly that, a permanent move. But at the moment, a little bit like Tanganga, it's loan options that have been presented to Spurs, which might be okay. And it is a shame, isn't it? Because amongst last summer's stories was essentially Levy finding an extra 100 million or so, investing to try and consolidate Spurs within the Champions League. And Spence, I think, was the 6th signing, which is why the social media team billed it as the 6th Spence, which was one, by the way, of the best unveilings of last summer, but not one of the best signings of last summer. And this is the problem for Tottenham. Too many of those players that were signed were just depth players, squad players. They didn't improve the starting 11 and the overall quality. And I think that Antonio Conte became very frustrated very early if there was that much money flying around that there wasn't more flagship signings. And I don't mean that with disrespect to Spence, but it's clear in hindsight that he wasn't integral to Tottenham since joining. I think it was only 4 appearances for Spurs last season, which only equated to something in the region of half an hour of actual match minutes. And then we know from there he went on loan to Rennes, which for me was the end of his Tottenham career. But the only interest to date in his services is for loans. And I think that he would need to drop down to the Championship as well. There might be some late interest from other Ligue 1 clubs. And I would keep an eye on Strasbourg, who are now controlled by Bluco, who are the owners of Chelsea. And even though he's not necessarily the profile, because it's about young signings and even where possible French signings, this might be a slight exception to the rules. So keep an eye on that. But again, that's only being discussed internally at Strasbourg at the moment. They've not moved. And then as far as the Championship inquiries are concerned, my understanding is that they're for loans. And there's 3 clubs that I would keep an eye on over the course of the next week if Tottenham decide to loan and Spence decides to drop down. And those 3 clubs are Swansea City, Bristol City and Leeds United.
There's a couple of comments there, Ben, speaking about Eric Dier, and I want to ask you quickly about his, what we're hearing is a tense situation regarding Dier's future at Spurs, which is, of course, remaining in the balance at the moment. He's got 12 months left in his contract, and while Tottenham are leaning towards preferably making a sale this summer to recoup a bit of a fee for the defender, he might prefer to stay for another year and leave for free at the end of the season. Now, like we mentioned earlier, I think it's pretty clear that he's not in Postecoglou's plans, and he hasn't even featured in a matchday squad this season, let alone actually get on the pitch for any minutes in the Premier League. Do you think we will see Eric Dier remain at Tottenham this summer, or is there potential for that one to gain legs in the next 10 days?
Not if Tottenham have their say. As you've alluded to, the club position is very clear. They want a sale. I don't think they're going to force him out, but there is some interest from Fulham, as we discussed earlier. But Dier is happy to stay and fight for his place. But it's really difficult to fight for your place when the manager effectively has made it clear that you're not going to be part of the matchday squad regularly, and there's no opportunity with even Europa Conference League football for Tottenham to rotate and give him much game time. So the most recent position of the player, albeit these quotes come from pre-season rather than specifically today or yesterday, is that he feels he's fit, and when fit, he believes he can fight his way into the side. So Dier's made his position clear in public and on record. And he's also said that he's ignoring social media, which is a very wise thing to do, by the way, and is solely focused on pushing to impress Ange Postecoglou, regardless of whether or not he gets a new deal. And that, from an optics point of view, is fine, but it goes against what sources indicate, which is actually that Postecoglou hasn't been that impressed necessarily by the player so far and his application or the way that he would take to the new system. And there's a few players, I think, that fall into this category, even if they're versatile, even if, of course, they've been in a 4-3-3 or a 4-2-3-1 before, that may not quite have the attributes that Postecoglou is looking for. Because regardless of the position, Postecoglou wants players that can move off the ball. Postecoglou wants progressive passers. Postecoglou wants intelligent footballers who are calm on the ball. Postecoglou wants players, regardless of where they are on the field, that can get out of position and back in position. And he wants to make the football field as wide as possible, which means that if you're a central player, you've got a lot of sideways running to do in order to win battles, in order to gain 50-50s, in order to make interceptions. And then, of course, if everyone's spreading out as wide as possible, those central players, centre-backs and central midfielders, can really set things off. But similarly, for the wide players, you've also got to be able to get back and be compact off the ball. So it's a different kind of movement. So we shouldn't only look at Postecoglou's style as a set formation, a traditional formation that anyone on form can ultimately play in. You have to have a very set skill. So goalkeeper in this system has to be someone that can play sweeper keeper and cover the centre-backs. They have to be a good shot stopper. They have to be very alert with their hands and feet. And I know that sounds obvious, but not every goalkeeper's like that. Some are asked to slow down the game. Some are asked to punch. Some are asked to stay on their line. Some are asked to gather the ball with their hands. Some are asked to build from the back in goal kicks. It's completely different. It's a position that has a lot of finesse. The centre-backs are going to have to be very tight, very confident on the ball and prepared to cover positions. The fullbacks are going to have to be wide and get forwards. And then in the more forward-thinking roles, you've got to be progressive and incisive with how you pass the ball. And again, you've got to be aware that there's going to be a lot of movement and width ahead of you. So service is important, but recovery is equally as important, because not every single thing is going to come off. So then what happens when you lose the ball? And I think players like Dier, and maybe there was even a question mark over others. Basuma, I think, will take to it well, but what about Hojbjerg, who could still end up at Atletico Madrid? These kind of players have got question marks, and you only have to look at the stats to see why, because even though we're only a couple of Premier League games in, Postecoglou possession is much higher than the average under Antonio Conte. It was about 50-50 under Conte, and the interims, it's been much closer to 60-65 even under Postecoglou. Shots are higher. Successful passes are higher by over 100, and so are, more significantly, passes and quick ones and progressive ones into the final third. So everyone has to link up, and I just don't know whether Dier has the attributes in his role to really fulfill that at speed and with consistency. And this is why I believe he's surplus to requirements.
Ben, it's always fascinating. I want to make everyone just be calm and be relaxed. The fact that I promise you, we are moving our way further and further up the pitch. But due to the nature of where Spurs are in this window, as you can tell, it's heavily dominated by, of course, potential outgoings. But don't worry, we'll be coming on to gift Orban. Hopefully, Ben has got plenty of gifts in store. See what I did there? And look, fingers crossed, there'll be some more about incomings. But if I could just quickly go back on, if I can, outgoings, Ben, because we're not finished yet, unfortunately. It's just unbelievable. Defensive-wise, Sergio Reguilon. Many people forget he was at the club. He's still there, Sergio Reguilon. We have seen reports that he's emerged as a target for Real Sociedad. He, of course, spent last season on loan at Atletico Madrid, but he was obviously, of course, hampered by a groin and hamstring respective injuries, which did unfortunately limit his game time there. Do you expect him to also move on before this deadline?
Yeah, I think the interest is still there from Real Sociedad. I'm not sure if anything's moved in the last 48 hours, but the last update that I had was that he was quite a high priority at left back, and the agreement was centered around a loan with option to buy. I think that Tottenham were trying for an obligation, but are comfortable with an option if something gets agreed. So this one stands a high likelihood of happening. There is actually some other interest in the player, I'm told, from both Ligue 1 and La Liga as well. So Tottenham can kind of take their time with this one a little bit, in the context, obviously, of the fact that the window's closing in only a few days. But the plan will be to complete some form of agreement with Sociedad, as of late last week anyway, one of the front runners for him.
Moving into the midfield, and as everyone will be happy, one step closer to Gift Orban. But in terms of midfield creativity, Spurs have got their main target in James Maddison, but there's a few other names that are being mentioned, and some that I'm sure might be dependent on a departure for Pierre-Emile Hojbjerg or elsewhere in that midfield. Those names are Chelsea's Conor Gallagher, Nottingham Forest Brennan Johnson, who's maybe a bit further forward up the pitch, and Eberechi Eze of Crystal Palace as well. Do you know if any of these are genuine targets for Spurs?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of discussion about a number of these targets. We can start with Brennan Johnson. My understanding there is that his preference is to move to Tottenham. It's as simple as that. So it's down to whether Tottenham and Nottingham Forest can agree a deal there. But the player's very keen on the move. And that's partially why Chelsea stopped exploring it, because they were under the understanding that if Tottenham came in and it was a straight choice between the two clubs, that Johnson would prefer Spurs over Chelsea. So they're now looking at other targets. So that's definitely one to watch between now and the end of the window. Conor Gallagher, the same. I think we actually discussed this when we were speaking the last time that I came on, and it wasn't as known that Tottenham were one of the clubs looking at Gallagher. West Ham, another one. Everton and Brighton sort of there in the distance. Brighton are worried about the players' wages, and I think that's partially why there was no discussion as far as any Moises Caicedo negotiations were concerned. So I don't see that one happening. West Ham is a very realistic possibility. Tottenham as well, they're on the radar. But the thing to understand about Gallagher is that he's been starting for Chelsea. And as a consequence, he's quite prepared to rebuff offers and fight for his place. So much like Lewis Hall, who moved to Newcastle, even though he only just extended at Chelsea, signing a 6-year deal with a 1-year option, but still left a week later, this is going to come down to Chelsea. Do they genuinely want to sell the player? And if so, Gallagher will go, because Chelsea make it clear that he's surplus to requirements. And of course, Gallagher's start to the season is a bit skewed because he's been playing, and part of that is down to the fact that Moises Caicedo didn't join on day one of pre-season, and nor did Romeo Lavia. So the feeling is that Gallagher's minutes might be diminished a bit and the door could be open. But it is going to cost around 50 million. I think the cheapest price you'll get for Conor Gallagher is 45 million, but Chelsea want around 50 million. So that's not an easy one to do. Whereas I think the negotiations for Brennan Johnson will be a little bit more simple. With Eberechi Eze, the Palace position is clear. They want to keep hold of the player. So it's going to be a massive fee if Tottenham or any other club are to succeed there, which I think makes it a little bit more unlikely. And then even though some Spurs fans may wonder why Kudus isn't being linked with Tottenham, first of all, West Ham are very close to a deal there, but I'm not aware that Spurs ever moved on that front, which is sort of surprising in some ways, because Kudus is an assist and goal machine. He's versatile. He can play in different positions. Brennan Johnson is a player with a high potential, but doesn't have the same goal scoring or assist numbers. So what Tottenham are looking for is ultimately more goal contributions, especially with Harry Kane having left the club. And I'm not sure personally whether Johnson is the answer. I have watched enough of him to know that he's got the drive, the hunger, the pace, the intensity, the energy, the stamina that will all be very conducive with Ange ball. But if we're only looking at it statistically and running the data, I'm sort of surprised in many ways that Tottenham didn't enter the race for Kudus, but they haven't. And now they're in a situation where they still want a creative-minded player who can add goals and assists. And I think that Gallagher and Johnson, of the names that you've mentioned, are the two likeliest of that bunch.
Ben, can I ask you? I'm going to let Matt come and ask you about Tanguay Ndombele in a second, but just on what you mentioned there with regards to the aforementioned names, Brennan Johnson and Conor Gallagher, I'm really intrigued to pick your brain just on your football knowledge as to where you potentially see, if you do, Brennan Johnson in a Tottenham side, if you feel would be more of a squad player, because it's a lot of money to spend on a potential squad player. And secondly, I might have asked you this before, so again, forgive me if I have asked you this before. Spurs and Chelsea haven't done business for a very, 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 very long time. Has, in your opinion, that now changed since, of course, we've had the ownership change at Chelsea? Do you think that is now a completely different relationship and the two clubs are open to doing business?
Yeah, I think the two clubs are very much open to doing business. And this has been a window where Chelsea have done business with Arsenal as well. It's a new ownership. It's a new era. And I don't think that Daniel Levy would have any problem buying from Chelsea. But I don't think that these new Chelsea owners would have any kind of issue selling either. And let's not forget as well that a few years back, before Todd Boehly was part of the consortium that bought Chelsea, he tried to buy Tottenham as well. And in trying to buy Tottenham, he would have had to approach Daniel Levy. So it's not like they don't know each other. And I think that the Boehly thing in all of this is to remove the rivalry and find deals that suit all parties. And if Conor Gallagher goes, it'll be a deal that suits all parties. So I don't think there's anything stopping Chelsea and Tottenham doing business together. Then as far as Johnson is concerned, it is an interesting one, because if you look, for example, at Nottingham Forest, they've been playing a 3-4-3 formation. And in that 3-4-3, Johnson tends to be leading the line with Danilo to his right and Gibbs White on the other side. Now, of course, from Nottingham Forest point of view, they then can bring on a player like Taiwo Awoniyi or Chris Wood. And as a consequence, Johnson can be versatile and move into a slightly different position. So we saw, for example, in the opening game, I think it was against Arsenal, Johnson leading the line, but then in the victory over Sheffield United, him moving over to the right-hand side of a front three. So that immediately tells you that he's comfortable in a variety of different positions. And a bit like Kai Havertz, I think he can drop a little bit deeper if it's required of him as well. So then if we look at how Tottenham play, you aren't putting him in any of those positions necessarily. I would still be surprised if Tottenham don't replace Harry Kane, bring in Johnson, whether Johnson starts instead of Richarlison. That's just my personal opinion. He could, of course, in theory, but I'm not convinced. And then when you look, for example, at a 4-2-3-1 formation, you're going to have Kulusevski, you're going to have Maddison, you're going to have Son. And I don't think he starts in front of any of those players either. So it's quite an interesting scenario. And it would suggest to me that he's there for depth. But obviously, the other thing in all of this is that if Postecoglou plays a more traditional 4-3-3, then does he feel that Brennan Johnson has more attack-minded qualities and versatility? Or does he feel that that pace is going to allow others like Maddison to have more freedom from central areas, and that's where he may fit in? But I think when I look at it on paper, I don't see Brennan Johnson being dropped into the current starting Spurs 11, but I think he would be very useful as far as depth is concerned.
I'm really excited by links like this where we can't quite figure out where a player would fit in. And, you know, Postecoglou, like a lot of managers in the modern game, and a lot of managers and Spurs were linked to it in the summer, likes to buy these players at an age where he can kind of mold them into what he wants rather than getting a ready-made player ready for a certain position. Just look at Pap Sarr, for example. I don't think any of us would have seen him as a midfielder getting into the box. I think I saw a stat the other day that last season he had one touch in the opposition box all season. And on Saturday against United, he'd 5 shots in the opposition box. So, Postecoglou saw something there that we weren't expecting, which I'm hoping could be the case with Brennan Johnson as well if we do get that deal done. But back onto the point of outgoings, Ben, some reports are saying that Spurs are prioritising the sale of Tanguay Ndombele, with both Galatasaray and Fenerbahce interested from Turkey. Now, Ndombele is understood to have not impressed Ange Postecoglou, which isn't the first time we've heard that during his time at Spurs, with his timekeeping and attitude. The issue this time around, Spurs want to sell if we can find a buyer. Do you think that's something they might be able to do?
Yeah, I think club sources deny, as you might expect, that the player has a poor attitude or was late for meetings or training sessions. But it's crystal clear that Tottenham are prioritising selling Ndombele, and there's a little bit of interest. One of the challenges is that Turkey is not necessarily the primary destination, as far as I'm told, in the player's mind. He's been waiting to see whether there's other options, so we can't rule it out. But Galatasaray and Fenerbahce, if they move, are going to have to convince him that that's the right league and destination. Rennes, and even interestingly, in the context of Brennan Johnson, Nottingham Forest have looked at the player as well. And I think this is a transfer that will get done because Tottenham are not looking for crazy money. It might seem quite high to the 2 Turkish clubs that are looking, but I would say £10 million, something in that ballpark, and a sale will get done.
We'll be looking to get a bit more for one of his former midfield partners in Pierre-Emile Hojbjerg, who was heavily involved in pre-season, but Atletico Madrid have open talks to sign him, and the Denmark international seemingly interested in that move. I'm sure the prospect of Champions League football next season playing a big part in that. Is that one that you think could get over the line?
I'm surprised it's not done already, to be perfectly honest with you, because as you say, the players wanted the move. Atleti have allocated him as a clear priority, and it feels like this was something that was going to happen much earlier in the window, but it hasn't. From Tottenham's point of view, if he stays, that's not a disaster, but he, as I alluded to before, is one of those players, again, that might fall victim to Ange ball compared to Conte ball. Does he quite have the right attributes? Which is strange to say because he's been an excellent player for the football club, but Postecoglou has to be brutal and not just think about a player's history and their qualities in seasons gone by, but work out who in that position is going to be best to bring out the kind of gung-ho, progressive, tactical mindset that he's looking to introduce this season. And I look at Hojbjerg, maybe others disagree. He doesn't scream to me front foot. And I think that it is a front foot player in that position that Postecoglou is desperately looking for.
Do you know if Rodrigo de Paul's failed move to Al Ahly, could that affect Atletico's move here in this one? Or do you know if they're separate?
It could be a factor. I think that from Atleti's point of view, they were not necessarily desperate to sell Rodrigo de Paul, but you're dealing again with a club, even though on paper they've got Champions League and it feels like they're big, in inverted commas, that don't have the financial flex and power to be able to pull off a lot of these deals, particularly when you sign a player from the Premier League. There might be agent fees, but there's also the wage as well. So it isn't only about the fee. Sometimes I think fans look at late window and they say, for example, with Ndombele, how on earth has he not been sold if it's only 10 odd million, 15 million max, I would say there. And the reason might be what the player's asking for as well. So there's a few complications, and the La Liga financial rules are incredibly stringent. So that's a factor in all of this as well. And I find it very obvious now, the gulf between these big European clubs outside of the Premier League and the Premier League clubs. Look at the spending of Bournemouth, even Burnley, who have spent some good money as well, all the way up to Spurs and obviously Chelsea. And then look at Atleti, look at Inter and one or two others that are in Champions League, into it in a Champions League final last season. And yet they can barely find 60 odd million without more outgoings. And that again is just modern football and how far in advance financially the Premier League is. But it means if a Premier League player is moving over to a La Liga side, they have to be able to afford the whole package. And Barcelona are obviously fighting to do that with João Cancelo. And that is why, in many ways, the Giovanni Lo Celso deal isn't likely to happen, to sort of move on to another potential outgoing so we can get to Harry Kane and strikers as quick as possible. From Barca's point of view there, they wanted a season-long loan, and Tottenham were not prepared to do that. And why do they want the season-long loan? Once again, it's because of finances. So Premier League clubs, when they do outgoings to other top European clubs, can't always have it their own way because it's not a level playing field. And that's the sort of paradox of the window. You said earlier, would Spurs do business with Chelsea? Well, at least if you do business with Chelsea, it's doable because it's two clubs on a kind of level playing field in terms of income that they're bringing in. So if it's a, in inverted commas, fair deal, nothing will stand in the way. But sometimes with a Barcelona or an Atleti, you come to a fair deal, but it doesn't mean those clubs can afford it. And I think that's the challenge that Tottenham have run into with Hojbjerg and potentially also Lo Celso to Barcelona.
Can I just clarify, Ben, if you don't mind, on Lo Celso there has been reports that, again, it's reports that have come out of Argentina. Apparently there's been maybe false or broken promises by Postecoglou in those early couple of games, and the fact that obviously he hasn't featured for them as many minutes as he might have done. From your understanding, is there been any concern there? And do you expect still Lo Celso to remain a firm part of Postecoglou's plans if there isn't a crazy offer that comes in the next, 8, 9 days, 10 of the window?
Yeah, crazy offer. And as far as broken promises are concerned, nobody is entitled to game time. So I would expect that from Ange Postecoglou, and players have to understand that nothing is ever guaranteed. You have to earn your starting spot, especially at a fantastic club like Tottenham. So if the reports are true, I can't personally stand them up in this case, but if those reports are true, then it's more evidence that Ange Postecoglou is a fantastic fit for Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, because if he's coming in only 2 games in and 1 pre-season in and making promises to players, then that is the wrong approach. Every single person, particularly under a new manager, gets a fresh start, and you have to earn that game time, whether you're an established player like Son, who's obviously been given the captaincy, all the way down to a younger player or a more unproven one. And I think if you've got that kind of manager that's not swayed by a dressing room, that's not fixed on his starting 11, that's fluid tactically as well, that's exactly what you want from a manager. And Postecoglou and Pochettino at Chelsea will win plaudits for being like that, because this is how you build a united dressing room. And I think that any manager is fully entitled to break a promise if that's what's happened, because nothing is guaranteed unless you earn the right to play for a club like Tottenham. And I think with Lo Celso, not quite there as far as the pre-season has gone in terms of being front of mind in Postecoglou's thoughts. So work to be done there. And again, outgoings are such a necessity for Tottenham, even if they're only temporary, even if it is only a loan deal. There's something that Tottenham need to do quickly, because it will be their undoing, regardless of excitement on incomings, if they get into the end of the window and that squad size is still in the mid-30s, because then you're always going to have factions, you're always going to have unhappy players, you're always going to have 2 sides to the story. And that's because you're creating a situation where 10 plus senior players are outside of your match day squad, and that's just not a tenable situation. And look at Chelsea last season. Again, I don't mean to be constantly making Chelsea comparisons, but look at Chelsea last season. They had this supposedly fantastic January, and nobody can dispute the young talent for the future that they've brought in. But they also had a dressing room in the back half of the season where half of the squad were unhappy. Half of the squad felt they trained well and weren't in the matchday squad. Half of the squad were not starting. Half of the squad couldn't even fit into the Cobham training ground in order to put their boots on for training. And you can't do 11 versus 11 if you've got 33 plus players, because there's a spare 11 plus players lingering somewhere, all talking, all moaning, all complaining, all maybe knocking the ball top bins in training and wondering why the manager's on another pitch and hasn't even seen it. So this is why, even if Tottenham don't bring in anyone between now and the end of this window, and they will, by the way, make 1 or 2 signings, but even if they don't bring in anybody, a gauge of success in the next week or so is going to be, can they get at least 5 out the door?
Ben, it's always fascinating. What we are going to do, we are going to go for our final break of this show for our listeners and audio. Can I just say again, a massive, massive thank you for all your incredible support. We've got over 1,400 of you watching us live here on this transfer edition of Last Word On Spurs. I'm joined by the brilliant Matty Hayes, always leading us through the role in the transfer market, and we're joined by the superb, brilliant sports broadcaster, journalist, the wonderful Ben Jacobs, blessing us with his footballing knowledge as to what is potentially going to happen in these final days of this summer transfer window. Matt, it's time to again rip off that plaster and go back to a subject I know many don't want to talk about. So I'll let you be the baddie in this, Matt. Over to you.
Cheers, Ricky. Appreciate that.
Sorry, bud. It's got to be one of us. It has to be one of us.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, look, turning our attention, Ben, to Harry Kane. And you notice, like we have for the entirety of the window, we've left until the end of the show, so we don't end up speaking about him for an hour and a half and then not having time for anything else. But Kane did complete that move to Bayern Munich a couple of weeks ago, as you already said, for a little bit more than 100 million, including all of those add-ons. Not the best start for him, losing that German Super Cup final, but he went on to register a goal and an assist on his Bundesliga debut in that huge win away to Werder Bremen. I'm just interested to know your reflections on the move itself and whether there was any surprise on your part that A, Spurs did accept an offer for Harry Kane, and B, that the player himself made that decision to move to Germany, even though he could have had the pick of a lot of clubs if he'd stayed for another 12 months.
Yeah, I think it's easy, isn't it, in hindsight, to say, why didn't he leave on a free transfer, see how Ange Ball went, give himself the option of a new contract at Spurs, and then still maybe leave on a free transfer. But it's a neat narrative that doesn't take into account one key point, which is in a year's time, Kane's another year older. And who knows at that point what kind of state his game is going to be in. Still a top-class player, but do Manchester United, especially given that they were always going to sign a number 9 this window, still come in for him, even on a free transfer? Maybe not. It would depend on the year that Kane has. It would depend on Rasmus Højlund and how he settles into the football club. There's no guarantees. Victor Osimhen might be available on the market, and because he's younger, Manchester United might decide to pay that money. You just don't know. Kane could get an injury and then not get any of the moves. So I think from Kane's point of view, turning 30 was a big deal, and he felt like he had to move right now. And then it became about Daniel Levy, and maybe the only surprise was that this was not a particularly acrimonious or difficult negotiation, which tells you two things. One, that Kane eventually indicated he wanted to leave and made it clear to Tottenham that he wouldn't be signing a new deal even after the window closed if he was still at the football club. And number two, that Daniel Levy realised that the money aspect was very important to the football club, and that put him in a slightly weaker position as far as just allowing Kane to stay at the football club and see out his contract. So if you'd have asked me 6 months ago, I'd have said that Tottenham, as I did when I came on, were quite calm about the situation. But I think the demise of Conte, the two interims, the lack of European football, all changed the complexion, and Kane decided that it's a fresh challenge that is needed to try and win some instant trophies and ultimately challenge for the Champions League. The other thing in all of this, which is a big factor, is Thomas Tuchel, and a very underreported factor to my knowledge, because when Julian Nagelsmann was in charge, Kane was against Bayern. That is my understanding. And this is why there was a line of reporting around 6-9 months ago, including from myself, that Kane had no real desire to move to Bayern. And a lot of that was down to Julian Nagelsmann, whereas things changed when Tuchel came in. And Tuchel wears his heart on his sleeve. He's a good man manager. He was obsessed with signing Harry Kane. So don't only think about this as money, and don't wonder why it was Bayern, not Manchester United. PSG obviously had an interest as well, but Kane didn't really want to go there. Look at this as Tuchel, because Tuchel and Kane's relationship in the build-up to this transfer, and obviously now as striker and manager, absolutely vital. And I think that's a very key and underreported part of the move. Then in terms of the actual negotiation, my understanding is that Spurs have got a very, very good deal. So of course it's disappointing, and I don't think there'll be a Spurs fan in the chat if given the choice between the money or the player would pick the money. But you've got to think about the long-term sustainability of the football club. And if Kane's going to go anyway, take the money. And that was ultimately Levy's perspective. But I come back to something that I reported a couple of weeks ago. The reported package is being billed as somewhere around 100 million. I'm told that with all add-ons included, it's actually somewhere nearer, potentially, not all the add-ons are gettable, but nearer potentially to 140 million euros, which I'm not good at maths in terms of euros to pounds, but that's got to be about 115 million quid. So I think that Tottenham have got an absolutely exceptional deal when you consider that Kane is not valued only on goals and profile and the fact that he's one of the best strikers in the world. He's also valued more negatively based on the fact that the contract was running down. So to get anything, whether it's 100 million or 115 million, anything in that ballpark is a very good bit of business for Tottenham.
Can I ask you, Ben, on that point? I know, Matt, you want to come in as well. I'm just intrigued to know from my perspective. We talk about that fee there. Do you know in any way, Ben, if there's been any talk about a potential buyback clause in there in terms of Tottenham or a return to the Premier League from your understanding? And then Matt can come in afterwards.
Yeah, I think with the buyback, there was certainly talk within the negotiation of a clause. I can't confirm the exact nature of that clause. Bayern are very coy, but from Tottenham's point of view, they were talking in the build-up about a clause that effectively gave them first refusal specifically if Kane returned to the Premier League. Now, the nature of that clause will be relatively complicated, but ultimately, in a simple sense, you would put in a specific number and buyback triggered only if Kane leaves Bayern and chooses to return to the Premier League. But you could have a slightly different clause that allows Kane to return to the Premier League and Tottenham to have some form of first bite of the cherry. But if there's no numerical valuation on it, the clause becomes quite complicated. I also think that the clause is irrelevant, though, because if Kane returns to the Premier League, I do think if Tottenham want him, which is an if, because they say never go back, then Kane would return to Tottenham. I don't think this is only about leaving Spurs. I think it's about winning trophies, learning a new language, in a new culture. It's right for Kane. It's right for his family. It's Champions League football. If he returns to the Premier League, he's not coming back in a season. He's coming back in, I would say, minimum 2 years. So he's already 32 years of age. And that's what I mean about the Manchester United point. Are they really going to come in for Harry Kane at 32, 33? But Tottenham might. And if he returns to Spurs at 32, 33, it could be a different role. It could be a squad role, which sounds farcical to say at this point. But 3 years down the line, you never know, because certain attributes of the game could just go to the point where he isn't the world's best striker at 32, 33 anymore. He's just a very, very good Premier League striker. So then there would be a decision on all parties as to whether or not Tottenham wanted to continue with him. And I look at Vardy at Leicester, which is my club, and I think the same thing. Vardy's not outstayed his welcome at Leicester, but last season in the Premier League, clearly he wasn't the same player as he was in 2015, 2016, when Leicester won the Premier League. And sorry to bring that up, of course, because Spurs were the challengers there. And I think you have to make a decision as to whether a player can redefine themselves. And I think that it's easier when you've got pace like Vardy to redefine yourself, coming on and playing a few minutes, going into wider areas, appreciating that you're a dressing room influence and more of a bit part player. I think it will be the same with Maguire if he ends up staying at Manchester United. But Kane's the main man. Kane's always been the focal point at Spurs. So it's all very well getting excited about a potential buyback clause, but you would have to ask the question, because we're not talking about 2023, 24, 25 even. 25 might be the earliest. We're talking about 2-3 years down the line. Would Spurs even want Harry Kane back? And I think that it would probably divide the fan base. So there might be a clause there because it was being discussed, but it's certainly not being confirmed at this stage by sources that I've spoken to.
Appreciate it, Ben. Matt, come back in there for us, sorry.
Yeah, I do have to say the eternal optimist in me still sees Harry Kane breaking that Shearer record in a Spurs jersey, but I know it's a bit more far-fetched now than it was 4 weeks ago. I just want to say as well, Ben, your maths is a lot better than you think, because that 140 million euro was just shy of 120 million pounds. So you were very, very close to that. I'm impressed. I just want to go back to one of the points you made there about Kane and his reluctance to go to Bayern Munich while Julian Nagelsmann was still the manager. And we know Nagelsmann is a name that was heavily rumoured to be an option for Spurs for that manager role. Do you think Harry Kane and his whatever feeling he has that he doesn't want to play for Nagelsmann, could that have been part of the reason why Spurs decided to move away from him? And I suppose a follow-on from that is, do you know how much Spurs were doing in terms of the manager and in terms of recruitment over the summer that was an attempt to appease Harry Kane and get him to put pen to paper?
No, I don't think that the Nagelsmann situation had anything to do with the Kane situation per se. Tottenham were exploring the market. And of course, there's two sides to all of this, because Tottenham have always downplayed that anything was particularly advanced with Julian Nagelsmann, whereas the Nagelsmann camp, much like they did with Chelsea, are adamant that they had opportunities in the Premier League and they decided to walk away. And Nagelsmann, because the manner in which he left Bayern Munich, has struggled to get work and opportunities, which might feel like a surprise from the outside in, but there's kind of no smoke without fire. And there's been too many jobs now where Nagelsmann's been the so-called front runner and Nagelsmann didn't get the job. And that's why I think that every single club that did their due diligence on Julian Nagelsmann must have been told the same thing from the Bayern side, which is that he is a phenomenal tactician. And I'm not here to slag off any manager or talk about how they act in terms of personal relationships. But what's clear is that certain players didn't enjoy working with Julian Nagelsmann and fell out with him. There's two sides from the perspective of, for example, Ryan Gravenberch. He feels like there was a smugness to Nagelsmann and he was too harsh in his decision-making and too fixed with his perception of players without giving them second, third, fourth opportunities. But from Nagelsmann's perspective, he thought that Gravenberch didn't have good movement and defensive discipline off the ball. So you can understand why the manager will feel like he had a player that wasn't fulfilling his tactics and the player feels like he didn't get clear instruction or development. But I don't think with Kane, the Nagelsmann situation played a part. From talking to sources, it was the opposite, in fact. If Harry Kane wanted to stay at Spurs, Harry Kane could have basically sat in the interview room and picked the manager. That's how much Tottenham were prepared to bend. So if at that point Kane had said, I'll sign a new contract if ... and that if was, I want to help pick the new manager, I want to help pick the new sporting director, I want to be a part of the recruitment process, I want to be involved in all of the data, in all of the science, I want to single-handedly be part of the strategy, not just the football side. If that was Kane's appetite and desire, then Tottenham would have allowed it. So this isn't a case of Kane not knowing what Spurs were doing or the direction that they were moving in. This is just a case of Kane turning 30 and deciding that in this forthcoming season, he wants a new challenge and he wants to play Champions League football. And I think that if you're Tottenham, you are rightly disappointed, but you also have to understand that Harry Kane may only have 4 more seasons at his very, very peak. Some would only say 3. And he has to think, therefore, about the legacy. And the legacy isn't only about breaking Shearer's Premier League record. It's about winning trophies. And I know everyone had a joke and a laugh about it, and Spurs were kind of the butt of the joke. But it is telling, isn't it, that game 1, within 24 hours of moving, Kane could have potentially won a trophy. He didn't, and Spurs fans might be a bit relieved about that, because it means that nobody could make that joke that it only took him 24 hours to win a trophy at Bayern Munich. But that's the point, that within 24 hours, he's still in a position to win a trophy. Perhaps not the biggest trophy, but still a first career trophy. And this is part of the thinking around the move. And look, if it doesn't work out at Bayern, he can come back after a season or two. So I think at 30, it was the right time for him to go. But from Tottenham's point of view, it's a shame, because my word, with Postecoglou and the bars and the front foot play, and then Kane finishing everything off, that would have been a lethal combination.
Absolutely. Ben, I have to always apologise. We always say an hour, and we always take you past an hour, but it is always absolutely fascinating having you on this show. You just talk and talk and talk, and we just listen and listen and listen. We absolutely love it. Again, so a massive thank you. Over 1,400 of you watching us live. For Ben, he's lucky the interrogation is slowly starting to come to a close. And now is the key question. Are Spurs bearing any gifts? Let's find out. Ben, obviously with Harry Kane's departure, there's a lot of talk about where Spurs go in terms of a replacement. I know in the build-up to this show, you've been driven mental by this one name of Gift Orban. But having said that, along with Gift Orban, Spurs have been linked with a whole host of strikers, including Jonathan David, Randall Moani, Dusan Vlahovic, Wilfred Gnotto, and even Tony. Intrigued to know from you, firstly, if you want to take on the gift question first, and then maybe we address some potential other strikers. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I think Gift Orban is there, but price is going to be the key determiner. He's only 21 years of age. Fulham and Lille are the other club that are circling, and Orban wants the move. It's just a case of whether he's worth that 25 million, perhaps even a little bit more. And there might be a sell-on clause too, but the Tottenham interest is very real there. There's a fair amount of buzz and excitement because of the season that Orban had. But remember, he's not played in one of the big 5 leagues last season, with respect to Ghent, and therefore a player that is going to need some time to take to the Premier League. So I still think there's a burden on Richarlison and a need, obviously, to get going in the Premier League, because once he starts scoring goals, he may be unstoppable. And that was proven by his form for Brazil, but sadly not for Spurs. So Orban, I think, is a possibility for Tottenham, but they've been very reticent to pay the fee. Jonathan David remains a really interesting one. If we're talking about fees, unfortunately, that's a very high fee, somewhere in the region of 60 to 65 million euros, but it could come down because David is keen on the move. And this is an interesting one because the only name, if Kane left under Paratici, that Tottenham were really seriously exploring when they first got wind, probably around March or April, that the Kane situation might be changing against them. The only name that they put forwards to begin with was Jonathan David, but that was under Paratici, and that was under Conte/interims. And now, again, Postecoglou is going to have his say. And I know that some other Premier League clubs have looked at Jonathan David and they're not so sure about whether or not he'll be a fit for Premier League football. The stats suggest he will, but the reality is, can he do it at a different pace and level? And that's what I'm most intrigued to see. But I certainly wouldn't rule out Jonathan David either. And the reason for that is because if the price is right, he's a far more long-standing target as far as Tottenham are concerned. And then if we look at the Jonathan David stats, what we see is a lot of strong numbers around expected goals tally. We see a healthy percentage of touches per game, somewhere close to 6 inside the opposition's box. So that's very encouraging. We see him create over a chance a game, which is healthy enough. It doesn't put him right at the top of the Premier League, but it's almost a chance and a half a game. Good pass completion record of over 80%, which is not bad for somebody in his position. And this might be the key thing that Postecoglou is convinced by if it's pitched to him: pass forward rate, which is not your sort of sexy number, but what it shows you is that he can drop deeper and find a intricate link-up pass, or alternatively, he can do something in the box with a quick transition that creates space for him or someone else to get a shot away. And again, that versatility, that fluidness, that unselfishness are all things that Spurs might look at. So I think what I'm told on David is that Tottenham would move if the price is 50 million euros. But if it's 60, 65 million euros, then they'll be looking at other opportunities. So Orban, yes. David, one to keep an eye on right until the end of the window. Then other names that have been linked. Vlahovic is no longer a Spurs target. I'm not sure they ever advanced anything there. Juventus would love to sell, but this was about Paratici again. I'd be surprised if Tottenham move in the final days of the window, even though it is absolutely true that Juventus would like to sell. And they want to try and bring in Romelu Lukaku if they can get rid of Vlahovic. Lukaku, nothing in the Spurs links. Sources very much dismissive of them on both the Tottenham, Chelsea and player side. So Vlahovic to Tottenham, not a target. And then with Gnonto at Leeds, they don't want to sell. Let's see whether or not they stick to that position. It wouldn't surprise me if they do. And of course, Ivan Toney is a very concrete target, but not something that Tottenham can do in this window due to the bans. So we have to wait and see whether or not that changes come January or next summer. But I think it would be a straight choice from Spurs' point of view at this stage between Orban or David if they are to, in inverted commas, replace Kane between now and the end of the window.
Can I just squeeze in one really, really quick follow-up question, Ben? I know there are Spurs fans pulling their hair out, watching this. They'll be screaming, listening to this, that Spurs pocketed, as we've said, potentially a huge fee for Harry Kane, and you illustrated just how big that fee is. Why is it, in your opinion, all about the fee when Spurs clearly, in the most polite way I say this, I know they invested big on Richarlison. It feels like, just in my opinion, I'm not sure he's going to work with Richie. I think he's a decent player. I just think maybe the step up to become Spurs' new, I know he doesn't wear number 9, but that's what we're looking for, a number 9. I'm just not sure he can do that job. So I know Spurs fans are screaming, thinking, why is the fee such a problem? We've just pocketed and just sold the best player in the club in their modern history. And why is what we're saying that? Sorry, but just in context, Ben, why do you think it's all about the fee? Why is that?
I just think it comes down to financial fair play to an extent, and also a lack of European football. I don't think Daniel Levy is averse at paying a fee. I think that Tottenham's position in the market has always been to find value, and they will intentionally negotiate, as we saw with David Raya in that failed pursuit, to make sure that things get done where possible on their terms. And some of that is a protection mechanism, because if they just decide to pay 10, 15, 20 million more on a target, then you can get held to ransom. And suddenly, when you move in next January or next summer, you're in a much weaker position. Look at Liverpool, for example. They, out the blue, put down an offer of 111 million for Moises Caicedo, despite sources indicating throughout the summer that they wouldn't move for Caicedo, and off the back of a summer in the build-up to the window where they said they couldn't afford Jude Bellingham. It just wasn't worth it. And the money that they put down, not in the wages and the agents' fees, but the actual transfer fee that they put down for their failed pursuit of Moises Caicedo, was more than they were trying to pay for Jude Bellingham. So make sense. And now Liverpool are out there in the market, and every single club they speak to is no longer dealing with the Liverpool of old and saying they're going to be tough, they're going to stick to their guns. They're saying, you've had 111 million in your back pocket. And everyone is looking at Spurs, not just in this window, but in the next 3 windows, and saying, you've got the Kane money. Why are you not spending the Kane money? Why are you being difficult over 5 or 10 million? That's one factor. The other factor is just, is the profile worth it? It's very easy for fans just to add 5 million, 10 million, 15 million, because we live in this football manager world where it doesn't feel that much. It's still 5 or 10 million. And Tottenham are in a position where they don't have European football. So I think we have to make that point very clear as well, that it's a balance, because Tottenham actually spent quite a lot last summer. They've brought in a series of signings this summer as well. So if they are to move and pay that extra bit of money for a David or an Orban, they have to be absolutely sure that the profile is not just depth, and that they're worth the price tag. And I think the other factor in all of this is, if they leave it as is and don't spend the money, they've got January, they've got next summer. Maybe they feel that there's some targets, like Tony is one, that aren't available now, that they're going to need that 50, 60, 70 million for from the Kane fee. So there might be a longer term plan here that we don't know about. And I think the last thing in all of this is just coming back to transition. Who's deciding what Tottenham are going to spend when Daniel Levy insists consistently he's stepping back? Scott Munn hasn't started, Ange Postecoglou is brand new, and no new sporting director has been appointed. If you're going to go to a new sporting director, maybe you're saying to them, we've got money because we're withholding a bit of money because the right profile is not available now. And when you start in January or next summer, you'll have a bigger budget because we restrained ourselves in the final days of this summer window. So that's one theory. Obviously, we're just putting out hypotheticals. Tottenham may surprise us. They may spend the 30 odd million, 25 million on Orban. They may decide that Jonathan David is worth it at 50 million instead of 40 million, because goals are obviously going to be necessary. So these are all considerations. The other name that I would add, which is very interesting, that would have a big price, is Lautaro Martinez. And that's probably the one that would excite the Spurs fan base the most. And first of all, I would say read reporting, not social media, because I've been quoted all week as saying Tottenham love Martinez and are going to move for Martinez. And somehow people have removed the final sentence of my reporting, which is Tottenham would love Martinez, but Inter are adamant they do not want to sell this summer. So in the context of what I've just said, is there going to be a January or a 2024 opportunity for a player like Lautaro Martinez? And can Tottenham work windows ahead to try and facilitate that? Because he's absolutely a player that they would love. But again, they've been told repeatedly over and over again that Inter at this stage, even with their financial constraints, won't sell. So there's another name there to keep an eye on. So then when we come back to this replace Kane, who's irreplaceable, obviously, do you move now just to kind of pacify the fan base and bring in a traditional number 9 of sorts? Or if you think you've got enough until at least January, do you see how things go and then realize that in January or next summer, some of these other names that I've mentioned will then become available on the market?
Again, just such fascinating stuff. The insight that we're getting here, and I hate to keep saying it, but it's truly fantastic. And I just want to say before we move on to the last question that Gift Orban for me would be an absolutely sensational signing. I've been lucky enough to cover the Belgian Jupiler Pro League the last couple of years at work, and I was watching. I was assigned to a game earlier this year where they played Zulte Waregem away from home. I think they won 6-2. It's Gift Orban's only his second or third game for Ghent, and he was in the second half absolutely ridiculous. He scored 4. I think he had a 5th disallowed as well, but he's every type of goal you could possibly want from a striker. He seems to be able to come up with it. And it's only 12 months ago, I think he became a professional footballer with Stabæk in Norway. You know, he's not been around for a very long time. He's just burst onto the scene, scoring goals for absolute fun. And the way I'm looking at where we move forward, like you said, Ben, Kane is irreplaceable. For me, if we get a like-for-like replacement, we will categorically be worse because we can't have someone who does what Kane does in a better way. So for me, we need to mix it up a little bit. We need to diversify what we're doing in that front line. And Orban is a player who's so technically gifted. He's got pace about him as well that I think he would just be such a nice player to slot into that number 9 position. And I'd be excited to see what he could achieve if he did make that move to Spurs. But we will move on to the final part of the interrogation, as Ricky likes to call it. And this is going to be a bit of a 3-parter for you, Ben. The first one is we want to ask if there's any update on naming rights or takeover talk for Spurs. And we had you on not too long ago, and again, more fascinating insight in the links between QSI and Spurs. So I was wondering if you could give us if there is any update on that. The second part of that question will be, what do you think would constitute success for Postecoglou at Spurs this season? And the favourite question that journalists always love to get on this question on this show is, how many players do you think Spurs will sign between now and 11 p.m. on the 1st of September?
Got to get the crystal ball out of this Stansted Airport hotel that I'm in. I'll ask Alistair Gold, who's hiding behind the laptop, to find me the crystal ball before I wrap up with that prediction. Nothing, to be honest, to add or get excited about on the naming rights. And I think that some of the challenge that Tottenham have is strategically, what do they want to do now versus potentially wait on to get either the best possible deal, because as we're seeing in the market, lots of football clubs are either for sale or have been sold, dating back to Chelsea, Manchester United on the market. And can you get a bit more interest or ultimately injection of finances because of the way that the industry is moving? So I think that the naming rights hasn't really progressed since the last time that I'm on. I know people love to speculate about Amazon. They've always downplayed any links, Coca-Cola, Google, and so on. All very cool, but most of these major brands are taking a step back and saying that the links historically that have been made are relatively exaggerated. And again, let's say coming onto the investment, which I've got more new information to speak about, there is a desire to bring in a minority investor or put the club on the market. Then are you using things like naming rights as a carrot on a stick to let them do their deal on their terms? Or are you getting it done first because then on the books, it puts another value and it enables you to get more for the club? And it's kind of chicken and egg with Manchester United and also with PIF and Newcastle United. They didn't want anything pre-done for them, which is why there was frustration at Newcastle that the betting front of shirt with fun was there and was locked in because it didn't allow PIF to instantly bring in seller. And now they have done, they've got an improved deal and they've got a brand that they're more comfortable with. So you sort of have to balance if you are going to put the club on the market. And we don't really know with Spurs at this point whether or not you want to do everything commercially you can first to get the highest possible value, or you want to leave some doors open. With the investment, QSI are not ruling out going back to Tottenham for minority investment. So, as I exclusively reported quite some time ago now, Daniel Levy and Nasser Al-Khelaifi had met to formally discuss minority investment. And this is because, off the back of the World Cup, the desire ultimately of the Emir and of Al-Khelaifi and Qatar Sports Investments was to get a stake in a Premier League club. Flash forwards and it gets complicated because, of course, Sheikh Jassim comes in to buy Manchester United outright, and then QSI quite clearly can't continue any talks with Spurs, even though it's made clear that Sheikh Jassim is one private entity and QSI are another. And the grey area is the fact that Nasser Al-Khelaifi has been a key voice and advisor in the Manchester United sale process from Qatar's perspective. So if nothing happens with Jassim, the 9-2 Foundation are not going to move to Spurs, but you still have QSI who are looking to invest in a Premier League club. If the Manchester United deal doesn't come off, they're not ruling that out. And QSI, in addition, are not only thinking about the Tottenham talks because they were quite formative, they are moving in a variety of ways. Sampdoria is the latest one with the former Leeds owner, Asa Ventures. And my understanding there is that QSI might break their mold a little bit because with Braga, they were only looking for a stake of around 23%, I think is the final number. And that's the club they've got. With Sampdoria, I think the QSI stake is going to be a little bit higher. It might be around 30%, but it could even be a little bit bigger. And then are they then, if, and it is an if, Sheikh Jassim is not successful with Manchester United, going to resume talks with Daniel Levy? The other thing I'm told is that Levy was quite reticent to progress with the minority investment that QSI were looking for. So this isn't only about QSI and Jassim, it's also about Daniel Levy saying to QSI, thanks for starting the conversation, but the structure and the nature of what you're looking for is not necessarily what I'm looking for. So that might imply that Tottenham are either open to a larger stake or for the right offer would also consider some form of outright sale. And then we have the Joe Lewis situation as well. And even though, as recent paperwork has shown, Lewis is not connected to Tottenham in the same way. So I'm not going to go into all of the detail because we're past 10 o'clock. So I'll be sending people to sleep. But ultimately, if anything comes of the Lewis case, it's not going to have a direct impact on Spurs. People are falsely speculating that should he be found guilty of these alleged charges, that somehow he would have to sell. And that's not how the structure of Spurs currently works. So this is not a club problem. But if, as we've seen, Lewis has stepped back and moved things into this sort of family trust or structure, is there still a kind of end game from the wider Spurs ownership that for the right offer they would move? And then where does that leave Daniel Levy? Does it become new owner, but Levy's part of the transition? Is Levy the one pushing for the outright sale? Or, as we've always understood, does Levy want to stay and have the operational day-to-day control, which would lend itself towards majority investment being taken off the table and minority investors being more preferable? So that all sounds, I know, very vague, but that's because this is a takeover. It's a business transaction. It takes months and months to facilitate. But the point with QSI is still they could theoretically return to the table and try and change Levy's mind on a stake of around, I would say, 15% if Sheikh Jassim is not successful at Manchester United. So it's still one to watch. And it also tells you that very privately and behind the scenes, and maybe even denying the progress that is happening, Tottenham are speaking to suitors. I know when I reported the exclusive, the initial Spurs perspective was just denial. And then, as you may have seen, everyone else stood it up and picked it up because it was clear from other sources that these talks did take place. So even though we have to be respectful to Spurs and say the club are denying it, these talks took place and everyone's now got consensus on that. And this again tells you that if Levy is going to have some investment with Tottenham, he's going to keep it a secret until it's very, very advanced, or potentially even exclusive. So let's see what the season brings there. But I do think that there are still active suitors considering Tottenham. And then the last thing, the simpler question, well, It's a simpler question, but a harder answer is the crystal ball question. How many signings do I think that Spurs will make between now and the close of the window? I mean, I could give you any number, but I don't think it will be higher than 3, and I think it will definitely be 1. So I'm going to do the horrible thing as a journalist and finish off by sitting on the fence and saying my prediction is 2. I think that there will be a centre-back, and I think there'll be a creative-minded player coming in.
Ben, you've earned the right to sat on the fence, given what you've given to us in this last hour and 45 minutes. It's been absolutely fascinating stuff. I know the viewers and listeners those that are watching this live have been blown away by just how much you've given us. We massively, massively appreciate it. I can say every time you come on, for me, it's a lesson. I know Matt massively, massively enjoys it. Matt, one unbelievable show, right? I'm sure you're going to express your love for just how incredible this show has been.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to be watching this back for the next week. I'm not going to lie to you. Really, really do appreciate the time and insight, Ben, and for putting up with us for nearly 2 hours.
You'll only be able to watch it back once, because I think the show has lasted a week. So you'll only get one opportunity to watch it back if you've only got a week.
One is enough.
Listen, honestly, we absolutely love having you on. Ben, I'm sure we're going to touch base with you in January, where you will then be asked the question what you think Spurs' season is going to look like. But before we do that, just please give our listeners and viewers the opportunity to follow you more closely. If I can't believe they don't already, where can they find Ben Jacobs?
Yeah, you can find me at Jacobs Ben, on Twitter at Ben David Jacobs, on TikTok and Instagram if you want the personal handles. As you may have seen from my feeds, I left CBS as a staffer, and I do have a new role that will be announced in September. I can't say too much more. There's a few clues out there on the feed, though, as to who I'll be working for. And then in the meantime, I'm also now doing Premier League commentary for TalkSport at the moment. So hopefully covering a few Spurs games. That's the other thing I do when the window shuts. I do the live Premier League commentary for radio and some television as well. So you'll hear me on a few games, do WSL as well. So keep across my feeds for more information over the coming days and weeks. But rather than making it about me to finish with my handles, I just want to encourage everybody to vote for you guys as far as the potential award is concerned. I know the QR code got slapped up, and you can stick it up there again. And I would just say, as we see football change, shows like yours are really important, because you know the club better than we do, and the passion that you bring and the guests that you get on are phenomenal, and you're here day on day. It's not just about the live shows, it's about the social feeds as well that you do. And there's a number of top shows out there for Spurs and other clubs as well that I really respect, and that's why I take the time to come on and play my part. I don't know if it's necessarily the best thing when you're up for an award to have me on. Maybe you could have won the award and then got me on. But
mate,
if
honestly,
I can play my part in just encouraging people listening to vote for you guys, because I would be delighted if your hard work is rewarded with an award.
Honestly, mate, we really, really appreciate it. Ben, it's always a pleasure. We hope to touch base with you in January. A fascinating, absolutely fascinating hour and 45 with the wonderful Ben Jacobs. I want to say again a massive thank you to our wonderful viewers and listeners. Over 4,000 or 5,000 of you watching us live tonight. Again, thank you so much for all your incredible support for Last Word On Spurs. From the wonderful Matty Hayes, from the superb Ben Jacobs. Guys, we've been the Last Word On Spurs. Please keep safe, keep well,